The World Chess Championship match is reaching its critical stage. We are halfway the event. 7 games have been played and the score is still tied. 3.5, 3.5. With a lot of exciting games being played. I'm very curious to see what is going to happen in that second half of the match. As of course the nerves are going to play a very important role. Who is mentally the strongest player at this point? Of course, the quality of the moves really matter, but how to deal with these nerves at this point, because both players, they feel under tremendous pressure. They have worked towards this moment for a very long time, and let's see how it works out in that second part of the match. Well, here is game 8. Ding Liren is playing with the white pieces, and well, he drops the first surprise because he opens the game with 1c4. That is the English opening. And we have not seen before the English opening in this World Chess Championship match so far. And it's remarkable that players are switching a lot from one opening to another. But that's what is really needed. It's not always about finding the objective best ways of playing, but really it's all about surprising your opponent. And this is probably something Gukesh didn't really expect for this game, although he responds with the move e5, knight c3, bishop b4, and he knows this line because after the move knight d5, the bishop is under an attack. This exact position was played by Gukesh earlier this year in a game against his fellow countryman Erigaisi. And in that game, he played his move a5 to defend the bishop on b4, but for this occasion he decides, let's go back to e7. It's another very big tabia in this opening. Basically, Black is saying that, okay, I'm ready to give up the bishop pair, but if you ever gonna take, I'm recapturing with either the queen or knight, and well, I'm going to complete my development pretty fast. Well, knight f3 was played here first, d6, and g3, c6, so now the knight is under an attack. And of course you have to decide here, what are you going to do with that knight? Well, obviously you're going to take with a knight on e7. Black recaptures with his own knight. And now after bishop g2, very interesting moment, as the next move is probably something you would never consider. I would probably not consider it myself either. But here Gukesh played this move f6. It really does look like a beginner is playing in the World Chess Championship match. Well, that's not Gukesh. Gukesh really has an idea with his move, as he overprotects the pawn on e5. And basically, he's preparing to occupy the center with both his pawns. Now, the idea is not completely new. f6 was seen in an earlier game of Arjan against Teodoro in Douglas 2023. In that game, actually, both players had castled already. But Gukesh says, I want to play f6 first, so that after castling, kingside by white, he goes for the move bishop e6 to attack the pawn on c4. Now the move b3 is played to protect the pawn, and Black plays the move d5. So this is everything according to plan, and I found it quite an ambitious way of playing. I mean, Gukesh is not really trying to equalize in a very solid way. No, he's creating this imbalance in structure, and I think that is what he has been doing in quite a number of games. He really does appreciate to have more space, so he really likes to advance his pawns at an early stage to give his own pieces more scope for maneuvering. And it's a very interesting way, a modern way of playing. Well, now the pawn on c4 is under an attack, but Ding goes for the move bishop a3. Remarkable idea, but it's important to realize that taking the pawn on c4 is very risky. This is something Black shouldn't do, because after d4, well, the position will be opened. White's bishops will come alive. You can put a queen on c2 to gain a tempo against the bishop. You can put a rook on d1 to try to gain a tempo against the queen as well. This looks incredibly dangerous for Black. Therefore, after the move bishop a3, Black decided here just to castle. Rook c1, and now the move a5. Interesting idea. Why do you play a5? I guess Black is preparing to develop the knight to a6, and whenever is needed, you can jump in with a knight to b4, neutralizing the pressure being exerted by that bishop on a3. Now, big question for White is also, how are you going to challenge the center eventually? Now, Ding has a very original plan, as he opts here for the move knight to e1. Interesting plan. He is preparing to reroute the knight to c5 From where it hits the bishop, it hits the pawn on b7. That looks pretty attractive. Black played rook e8, overprotecting the knight, so the queen is free to move as well. But now, instead of moving the knight to d3, he goes for this plan with f4. Super ambitious, and really, I have never really seen such a structure. I mean, the plan with f4 is not unusual in a lot of openings, but here it's a totally fresh position. I mean, both players have to come up with their own plans, and it's practically difficult to play for both sides. I tend to believe that, because there's so many questions to be answered, like how to cope with the tension in the center. Is who's going to take first, who's going to advance the pawns. Well, here Gukesh decides to take on f4. White recaptures with the rook, and now Gukesh follows it up by taking also on c4, removing his other central pawn. And after b takes c4, you cannot get a sharper, complex middle game than this. I mean, you have the imbalance of bishop pair versus bishop knight. You have a asymmetrical pawn structure. And of course, white has the bishop pair and the position is quite open. But it's not really clear what the bishops are going to do at this point. Knight g6 hits the rook on f4. And the rook now goes to e4. I mean, this is really classical chess, guys. I mean, I know that before this World Chess Championship match, there was this freestyle chess event with a random starting position, and pieces were shuffled on the back rank in the starting position. It looks more like a freestyle game, to be honest. This is not a typical classical game of chess, but I really like it, and it really poses problems for both players. With the rook on e4, looks quite remarkable, but it's ready to exchange it for the rook on e8 anytime soon. Knight a6. So again, the knight is heading for the b4 square, and therefore the knight goes to c2 to cover that square sufficiently. Black played the move queen c7 to connect the rooks. Makes a lot of sense. And here the knight comes in to d4, attacking the bishop on e6. The bishop safely goes back to f7. And white played here the move d3, overprotecting the rook on e4. You're always going to recapture with the bishop, of course, not with the pawn. Keeping a nice grip in the center. And long-term speaking, I mean, white's pawns are not occupying the center. But later, when more pieces are coming off the board, these pawns, they can become a very important asset for white. Now, black played here the move knight to e5. I think it's an interesting move, avoiding the exchange of rooks. And, well, there are also ideas, for instance, to challenge that rook on e4. Well, white played here the move knight f3. It's an interesting idea, but still, something like bishop g6 looks a bit annoying, at least from practical perspective. Like, what is white gonna do with that rook on e4? Now, the knight went back to d7. So Gukesh says that he wants to keep the knights on the board. In general, it's very understandable, because the more pieces are coming off the board, the stronger the bishop pair will become. So knight e7, rook takes back. And I would say this is a very important moment in the game, because white is doing pretty okay. Black is also doing pretty okay. But how to approach this position as white? I was thinking that something like queen d2 does make a lot of sense to overprotect everything, including this unprotected pawn on a2, to cover the pawn on e2, and also to free the first rank for your rook, so you can easily shuffle around with your own pieces. It's a very flexible way of playing. I do like it, but I think that with Ding's next move, rook to b1, he's trying to exert pressure on the b file, long-term speaking. Imagine you do get a chance to double with the queen and rook on that file. I mean, there can potentially be quite a bit of pressure, but black played an excellent move here. Gukesh went for the move b5. And he is trying to seize the initiative by very concrete ideas. Because after c takes b5, black inserts queen b6 with check. The king goes to f1. And now it is c takes b5. And here you see that black has created a majority on the queen side, 2 versus 1. And that is quite nice news, because there are ideas to come forward with the pawns, but also the pawn on a2 is a serious target. So what should white do? I mean, white can defend the pawn, but you don't really want to tie down your own pieces defending such a potential weakness. So here Ding played the move bishop to b2. Remarkable idea, because he is giving up that pawn on a2. with tempo. I mean, the bishop captures, hits the rook on b1. But now Ding said, okay, I put the bishop on d4. The bishop is on a much better square now, attacking the queen. And there's still pressure. The queen got to keep the pawn on b5 defended, otherwise the rook is going to take there. So here, very important moment. And apparently, Gukesh misses here a huge chance. He played a move, knight a to c5. And in my opinion, this is a very natural move because normally you don't want to have knights at the edge of the board. You want to bring them back to the center. And apparently the machine disagrees. The machine says you should use the other knight. And to be honest, I have been following the game. I've been analyzing this game. And I don't really understand why this should be such an obvious move at all. I mean, I understand there are some ideas and I will try to explain it in a second. But to be honest, it feels really wrong to keep that knight on a6 from a human perspective. But let's see what happened after the game's continuation. Knight ac5. As white moved the rook away from b1 to c1, exerting pressure here against the knight on c5. And it's super complicated. I mean, white has to exert pressure now against black's pieces, because if you're too slow, black eventually is going to push his own pawns, and that's going to prove to be decisive. But here, okay, Gukesh has to find a way to consolidate his position. And he decided now not to run with the b pawn immediately, but playing here the move bishop b3 to attack the queen. And I guess the point is that it does prevent white from placing the queen on c2. With the queen on c2, there's this huge threat against the bishop and against the knight. So therefore the move bishop to b3. The queen goes to e1, and it looks like the queen is badly placed, normally speaking. But here the queen is ready to go to f2 very soon. And still, it's a very messy position. But now Gukesh went with the bishop back to e6, overprotecting his other pieces, as in other cases, let's say if you do play something like rook c8 to protect the knight, there's something like bishop h3, and that could be a reason why the knight from d7 could have been better placed on a6, like in the other line. So it is very complex, but let's have a look. After bishop e6, white played the move queen f2, attacking the knight on c5 one more time, rook c8, and frankly speaking, I think that Gukesh must have felt that he is doing fine. Everything is protected here, and he has a chance to march forward with his pawns, and perhaps he assessed even the position as to be winning for black. However, at this point, Ding Liren has an absolutely amazing resource as he went for the move bishop e3. And again, I was looking at it and it took me a second to understand what is the idea, because it doesn't really create a new threat. That's what I thought. But by moving the bishop away from e3 to d4, white is all of a sudden threatening now to play the move d4 to attack the knight on c5. And you see that because of that knight on d7, the bishop is not defending the rook on c8. That is an absolutely incredible idea, bishop e3, and it's actually black who has to be very careful not to lose a piece now. He played rook c7. Makes a lot of sense. If you do play d4, there is knight e4 with a counterattack, and if the rook on c8 would have been there, well, there's rook takes c8 with check. So that's why the rook is well placed on c7. White cannot exploit the weaknesses immediately with d4, but there is a very interesting idea. Apparently the machine wants to go for knight e1. My goodness, I really don't understand the idea when I saw it, and it was also not played by Ding. But the idea is, once again, that if you do play a random move, let's say you go for b4, you can go for d4 now to attack the knight on c5. If the knight goes away, you can play d5 to attack the queen on b6 and to hit the bishop on e6. And in the meantime, you can take on c7. Black doesn't have time now to take on c1 with check. So that's why the knight is well placed on e1. You can see that this is a super complicated position and both players are missing chances at this stage. Instead, Ding played another pretty strong move. He went for the move knight d4 to threaten to take on e6. So the bishop goes to f7. And now the knight goes to c6. I also like this way of playing. I think it's a very human way to play, as by placing the knight on c6, you disconnect the rook from defending the knight on c5. And here the knight on c5 is 3 times attacked and only twice defended. Black is forced now to give up the rook on c6. So bishop takes, queen takes, and there is bishop takes c5. White is up the exchange. Okay, black has one pawn for it. Should be pointed out that white's king is a bit open, although an immediate check on h1 is not threatening here yet. And therefore, okay, how to play this as black? I think Gukesh made the right decision. He kept the knight on the board. Don't take on c5. It will really help white to untangle. He played now the move h6. It's a very useful move to create an escape square for the king to avoid any sort of back rank nonsense later on. And how should white consolidate his position? Well, Ding brought his king to the center. I think king e1 is a good move. And Gukesh played b4 very quickly as players were getting lower on time. And, well, it does seem to make quite a bit of sense as you prevent the bishop from ever coming back to a3 and protect the rook. So therefore b4 played. But again, this is a very important moment in which Ding had a very good chance to get an almost decisive advantage, because with something like king d2, he is protecting his rook on c1, preparing to move the bishop somewhere, and well, he has good chances to convert. Now, he did something very similar in the game. He started with the move queen d4, and again, it does make sense to centralize your strongest piece. But after the move knight e5, the knight is excellently placed there. Now Ding played the move king d2, but there is this move queen g2. And perhaps this is something which Ding had underestimated at this point, because the pawn on f2 is hanging, on h2, pardon me, but also knight f3 is a huge threat, forking the king and queen as the pawn on e2 is pinned. So here, look at what happened. Ding went back with the queen to f2, offering the exchange of queens. Of course, black is not going to help him. Queen d5 back. And here it is queen d4. And it's move 39. The moves were repeated. And on move 40, queen d5 was played. And, well, Ding said, okay, I want to really exchange queens. Maybe he could have considered a move like bishop d4 and try to play on. But it's not obvious how to make progress here as white. Queen d4 was played, and if black wants, he can go for the move queen g2 and claim a threefold repetition. However, remarkably enough, at this point, getting an additional 30 minutes, Gukesh went for a think and decided to play on here with the move queen a2 check. You're an exchange down in a World Chess Championship match playing with the black pieces. It's game 8, and you say that you want to play for a win here as black. And it reminds me of earlier games in which Gukesh was objectively speaking not better at all, but he said that he likes to play chess. Well, I think it's more than that. I think he believes that Ding is more nervous than him, and he is really trying to pose him more practical problems, even though the objective evaluation is not in his favor. After queen a2, there is rook c2, and the queen got to go back. Well, the queen goes back to e6. But what is happening here? Well, the game goes on, and it is super unclear, but you can imagine there are potential threats here with pawns coming forward. Now, there are some absolutely insane lines, and Ding, instead of having this repetition of moves earlier, he now needs to think how to play on. Am I playing for an advantage? Should I try to make a draw? There are, in fact, quite a number of options here, and I think that the most challenging move is queen d6. This was not played, but if you can exchange queens, that would be fantastic news. Let me show you one absolutely amazing line. Apparently, black has to play very precisely here to hold the balance. After queen h3, white can go for the move bishop d4. If you can get exchange, if you can exchange that knight on e5, that would be awesome. But apparently, knight f3 is the only move to save the game here. After e takes f3, queen g2, king c1, queen f1, the king can run around, but after something like queen d3, you're rook down as black. Okay, you do have two pawns for it, but it's opposite colored bishops, and there are threats like bishop g6 to put pressure against the rook. If the rook moves, there are mating ideas on b1, there are checks on a3. Apparently this is a draw. But okay, I think black is the one who needs to be very careful here. I think queen d6 could have been a very good practical attempt for white to keep on playing here. But instead, Ding, as he already has shown in earlier games of the match, but also in this game, he is not unhappy making a draw, even from a better position. Like, he played here for the move, he played here the move queen d8 check, king h7, and he took the pawn on a5. And it's very understandable, don't get me wrong. I mean, if you can get the second pawn, it should probably be winning. But okay, black is going to play here the move b3, hitting the rook on c2. And the rook, well, it has to move, obviously. And you don't want to block it, and the rook is very passive. So the rook can go back to c1. And here, if you ever go b2, the rook can go to b1. And then the b pawn, the passed pawn, will no longer be defended. But queen d5 was played here. It's the only move for black. It's a really good decision. And if white is playing a random move, just for the sake of illustration, like if you play a random move, I pass the move over, there is b2 as a huge threat. And the rook is under attack. The rook got to retain control over the passed pawn, but there will be knight c4 with a very deadly knight fork exploiting the pin on the d file. So, therefore, the queen got to go back to b4. Makes a lot of sense. And here it is, queen to g2, putting pressure on white's king side. I mean, if you get a chance here to take pawns on h2 and g3, black should definitely be okay. And it's clear that his king is safer than white's. And again, I think here Ding realized that position is quite sharp, and there are several options. But he decided anyway now to offer the exchange of queens. He played queen e4, forcing the exchange of queens. Queen takes queen, pawn takes back. And okay, if you can play bishop d4 and block the pawn, it would be game over. White would be winning. But there is b2 attacking the rook, rook to b1. And there is bishop a2. And that is the equalizer in the position. Because after rook takes pawn, there is knight c4 check, king c3, knight takes b2, and the players agree to a draw. Because after king takes b2, I mean, this opposite colored bishop endgame is a dead draw. I mean, there's no chance here to play on for both sides. But that is an absolutely incredible fight. And both players had chances in this game to score the full point. But I don't know if it's really nerves at this stage. Probably it's part of it. I think it's also the way they are playing. The games are super complex. That explains why both players are making a lot of mistakes as well. Well, the score now after 8 games is 4-4. 6 more games to go. And who is going to be the World Chess Champion 2024? That's the big question. Hopefully I will be answer this question in a couple of days. Stay tuned for more developments by subscribing to the channel. If you haven't done yet, really appreciate all the support. Also all the PayPal donations, really much appreciated, guys. And please come back to the channel and make sure to see who is going to be the new World Chess Champion. Bye-bye.